I show you this first. It was shot as a publicity shot on September 11th, 2000. And as you can see behind my head is the World Trade Center. We have had our world truly turned upside down, especially those of us in New York City who happen to live by the World Trade Center. And we have seen virtually everything that we assumed about how the world worked and how power was structured and who we should fear and what risk represented challenged in the last year, particularly in New York City. Just to, oops, I guess that is not something I should press. What should I press? There we go. Just to give you an idea of what we went through, at first blush this might not seem appropriate to raise in an infectious disease conversation. This is a shot taken by the space shuttle from outer space of New York City on September 11th. To orient you, you're looking at the plume at ground zero. That plume is flying over, completely obscuring the Brooklyn Bridge into Brooklyn. The most populous borough of New York, home to 2.5 million people. That almost completely obscured park, Prospect Park, is actually larger than the famous Central Park of Manhattan. We now know that the plume, which caused grave concern for all of us who inhaled massive quantities of it, did not contain the things about which people were fearsome. It did not contain the things that prompted legal action, forced the Environmental Protection Agency to reassess its position, which was that there was nothing dangerous whatsoever that happened on September 11th, except if you happen to be in the World Trade Centers. And in fact, it's true. These buildings did not contain asbestos. We did not get the release of huge amounts of PCBs and other toxins about which people are very concerned. In fact, we got something much worse. We got a completely unprecedented medical event for which we have no diagnosis, no clinical name, and no concept of what it will mean to the health of the people exposed in the long run. What turns out to have been in the plume? According to studies done by Rutgers University team, the plume contained two things that have vitally damaged our lungs. First, it had pulverized glass from the World Trade Centers in a perfect size for entering the deep lung, 1 micron in diameter. Most of those glass particles turn out to have been contaminated with human cell fragments and bacterial cell fragments, which every pulmonologist will tell you constitutes worst case scenario for long-term hyperreactivity of the lung, having a mixture of antigenic material with lacerative material. On top of it all, something very unusual happened with this event. One can usually draw a parallel between, for example, a volcanic or natural occurrence that's an air pollution event and something like this and say, well, we know how the human lung responds because in a volcano it does X, Y, and Z. But in fact, volcanic eruptions are acidic and the human lung is an acidic environment. Turns out the pH of this plume varied between 8.5 and 11.6. The most alkali exposures human lungs have ever seen. We have absolutely no medical precedent. We have no idea how the human lung responds to this. The one thing we have noticed is about 400 firefighters who were direct responders have now been declared permanently disabled. They suffer what is being called World Trade Center cough. It is basically thought that they will the rest of their lives cough their brains out. And in the borough of Brooklyn, we've seen a 23% increase in what is obviously an incorrect diagnosis, but for lack of any other clinical diagnostic term, people are calling it adult onset asthma. And it is noteworthy that these individuals who suffer from this have hyperreactive lungs that are now responding to all microbial assaults in an unpredictable manner, with very prolonged influenza, heavy bouts of common colds, all sorts of bronchitis. In other words, we've created a pool of somewhere between tens of thousands, roughly, of people in greater New York City who are going to be more susceptible to pulmonary exposure with microbial agents than they would have been before September 11th. All of which is to say our world has changed. In the United States, 5 envelopes with anthrax in them turned everything upside down in the fall. And there were some what we might say positive outcomes and some clearly negative ones. As we talk about what the sort of social ecology, if you will, of infectious diseases, think very carefully about what just a handful of letters did in the United States and in fact all over the world. These surveys were done by Blenden's group at the Harvard School of Public Health, just around the corner from where Paul Farmer is. And what they saw is that even nationally, all the way out to Hawaii, people said they felt 4% of the population thought they knew someone directly affected somehow by these very small number of exposures. Obviously in Washington, D.C. And in New Jersey, where the letters went through the postal system, there was a much higher degree of anxiety. Similarly, we saw the nation's mail system was disrupted all over the country, not just in the immediately affected areas. When you get down to asking questions like, how fearful are people for their own lives? Do they think they or their families are going to suffer anthrax disease and be exposed? Again, you see a very remarkably high rate of positive response. And I think extremely importantly, nearly a third of the American population took precautions last fall to personally protect themselves against this alleged terrible assault that they felt was going to victimize them. I can tell you that to this day, I'm not allowed to open my own mail at Newsday because New York newspapers were specifically targeted. We don't know if I lucked out, dodged a bullet because the mail never got to me, or if in fact the assailant doesn't read Newsday. Regardless, I'm fortunately here, and all my mail is now read by people who wear masks and gloves and open it, and then I get it. So don't snail mail me, I'll never get it. And we saw that all over America, people took personal household precautions to protect themselves. And the crucial line there, got a prescription or purchased antibiotics, 4% of the American population. In fact, we completely ran out of ciprofloxacin in the United States in October of last year as a result of an enormous number of physicians obviously violating the basic tenets of attaining an MD and writing a prescription without indication for an incredibly important antibiotic. An antibiotic that we already know is likely to select for resistant strains. This is from the National Health System in the UK, where ciprofloxacin has been the drug of choice for gonorrhea treatment since 1991. And here we have motivated patients, motivated physicians, clear diagnosis, ideal health setting, and we still have seen a steady upward trend in resistance in the gonorrhea population. Physicians in Brooklyn reported in Journal of Infectious Diseases about 3 months ago a sudden upsurge in ciprofloxacin resistance for a number of enteric microbes in Brooklyn, very possibly, though we have no direct way of proving it, related to widespread misuse of ciprofloxacin last fall during the anthrax episode. So one event sparks another one, sparks another one. We can't even begin to imagine on our event horizon where 9/11 and the October 4th and subsequent anthrax letters really is going to take us. The ripple effect, I liken it to looking at a pond of water. We've dropped a rock in it, and we've seen the first 2 ripples go out, but we're a long way before we see still water once again. Well, there were a number of reasons, obviously, why we have responded in the United States the way we have to all these episodes. I'm not going to make any excuses for my government or try to explain my government today. And please don't ask me to do so because as a journalist, I have to remain objective. However, we have spent astronomical amounts of money, particularly given the very modest sums we've heard described to address infectious diseases in previous conversations, to prepare our nation in a sense of homeland security. And now that the Republicans have swept both houses of our legislature, they will undoubtedly pass the Homeland Security Bill, creating a cabinet-level position and an enormous budget to deal with protecting America. It might seem an overreaction for 5 envelopes of anthrax and so on, but we believe we have further reason for this. I don't want to overlap too heavily into tomorrow's bioterrorism session. I'll just simply say that obviously biopreparat in the former Soviet Union not revealed to the international community to even exist until 1992, not stopped until 1993, with widespread indication that the Ministry of Defense's parallel program, which biopreparat was an allegedly civilian program, is still underway in Russia. Biopreparat employed some 60 to 70,000 scientists and technicians working in 60 different labs and test sites for the sole purpose of making deliberate epidemics of massive lethality and extraordinary transmissibility. I visited the biopreparat's primary facility for viral manipulation called Vector, located outside Novosibirsk, Siberia in 1997. And there, in what you can see look like fairly crude facilities, they were in fact genetically modifying a wide range of organisms, 122 genetic modifications of smallpox alone. That funny looking doubled set of chambers is what an infected scientist was meant to be isolated inside of until he or she either died or recuperated from whatever they had been exposed to. And in fact, in this facility, one scientist had died of Ebola. And they had been working with creating Ebola chimeras with a number of different other kinds of airborne organisms in order to result in an airborne Ebola. We don't know where most of the scientists who were involved in this program are today. We don't know what happened to the microbes. There are no clear manifests or inventories one can turn to and say, oh yes, you had, 800 tons of smallpox or whatever. We do know that the scale of production, particularly for anthrax, was enormous, enormous. This was the biological equivalent of an all-out nuclear proliferation. It's also become apparent that though we declared smallpox eradicated in 1977, officially a little later than that, and it was agreed that all samples of the virus were to be sent to just two facilities, the Ivanovsky in Moscow and the CDC in Atlanta, that the Russians certainly moved it out of the Ivanovsky without telling anyone for the sake of their biological warfare program, and also that not all nations may have turned in their supplies in the first place, which comes to the current controversy in particular about North Korea. Is widely felt in security circles, both in Europe and the United States, that North Korea possesses smallpox. So we went into a pell-mell rush in the United States in the last year to prepare. And one of the things that happened was the Congress, got a little upset when anthrax showed up in Congress, in the Senate building. And they started asking, how could it be that we don't seem to have a safety net for these things? And then they suddenly woke up and realized, gee, for the last several decades, we've been slashing public health budgets at every single tier of government in the United States, reducing our commitments to the World Health Organization, and I guess we've created our own weakened safety net ourselves. In fact, the CDC testified before Congress last fall that before they suddenly woke up to the dismal situation of our infrastructure, only 45% of the American health departments had fax machines. Only 20% had email capacity, and only 48% had any access to the internet. They were discovering that there was a tremendous lack of standardization in laboratory work. And in light of Janet's comments, I should point out that last fall we had an interesting thing happen. On September 11th, of course, we had the attack on the World Trade Center. But on September 10th, not noticed by most people around the world, dengue was diagnosed in Honolulu. And it was soon discovered that the mosquitoes carrying dengue were on Maui, on the Big Island, and on Oahu. Of course, it's an entirely tourist economy. If you said there was one case of dengue hemorrhagic fever in Hawaii, there'd never be a tourist on those islands again. The Hawaii Public Health Department urgently requested assistance from the CDC, but oops. You know how we talk in military budget terms about the ability to wage war on two fronts simultaneously? I don't know if any other country is as insane as mine about this, but our military insists that it has to be funded to a level that it could have two simultaneous wars somewhere in the world. Well, public health clearly isn't funded on a scale for a two-front war. The CDC, when called about dengue, said, good luck, Hawaii, we're a little preoccupied right now. And Hawaii ended up having to couldn't get reagents sent to them, couldn't get a standardized kit of any kind sent to them. They ended up shipping all their dengue samples through the much beleaguered postal system because of anthrax all the way to San Juan, Puerto Rico for analysis, greatly slowing their ability to stop that epidemic. So we clearly discovered that the what would happen problem is we're not ready. So Congress has put $1 billion into trying to bolster local public health throughout the United States, and $1.75 billion additional just to the National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Diseases under the control of Dr. Anthony Fauci to come up with solutions for bioterrorism on the laboratory level. So it's boom time if you're into tularemia in America. Oh yeah, we got money. Do we have anybody that can do a peer review? No, but we got money. And we'll somehow spend all of it because that's the mandate, spend it all in 12 months. Well, the other thing that, of course, has startled everyone involved in politics in Washington is the prospect of smallpox. And as you've all undoubtedly heard, we've had a massive program to create a new smallpox vaccine using technologies not previously used, so testing it and making sure it's safe and all that's going to be a little dicey. And we've gone through and diluted our old stored samples, tested to make sure they are still okay. The goal is, as our Secretary of Health and Human Services, Tommy Thompson, puts it, to have a dose of vaccine with every American's name on it. It's comforting to me, for me to know that somewhere there's a little vial saying Laurie Garrett. And the truth is it doesn't comfort me one bit because the last time we had smallpox in the United States was 1947 when an individual who had gone to Mexico apparently acquired smallpox in Mexico, came to New York City as a tourist and visited everything from the Statue of Liberty all the way up to the cloisters, hitting every hot spot on Manhattan before dying of smallpox. This was coming right out of World War II at a time when Americans had great faith in their government, not like today. And I don't, no, I mean this. Americans have become extraordinarily me first. We have this expression, NIMBY, not in my backyard, which is why we can't spray for mosquitoes in North America anymore. Americans want no risk personally to themselves whatsoever, and we've had a tremendous decline in a sense of community spirit and the notion that government could be for any positive purpose whatsoever. But in 1947, that was not the attitude. And in fact, 6.5 million New Yorkers lined up obediently and got their smallpox vaccinations in 6 weeks' time. It's a phenomenal effort that could not be repeated today. And there's a number of reasons why it could not be repeated. Many have to do with this weakened infrastructure and the lack of personnel who even know how to administer with a bifurcated needle a smallpox dose vaccine properly. But it also has to do with legal things, with the change in many of our laws, including such things as quarantine. Well, the other thing that's changed since 9/11 is that every single darned epidemic that appears anywhere, we suddenly assume first and foremost it was a deliberate release rather than a natural event. We now have a Senator Patrick Leahy, who has called for congressional hearings to determine whether or not West Nile virus was released on us by Iraq or God knows who in 1999. I mean, this is a helicopter spraying over my neighborhood in Brooklyn for the West Nile virus and the mosquitoes, Culex, that carry it. It is curious that a virus normally found in a North African ecology that is very wet, very hot, and has an entirely different range of mosquito populations and birds, should have found its way into our concrete jungle of Manhattan and Queens, and now be in more than half of all the states in the United States, and have claimed a higher toll this year than in any previous year. Still, I doubt very seriously that anybody would have been nuts enough to think that a vector-borne virus would make a terrific biological weapon. Still, back to that one point I was trying to make, we've long since abandoned a lot of the infrastructure that would have made the control of either a deliberately released epidemic or a truly new and novel acute epidemic easy to do. And one is that we no longer really have much in the way of quarantine laws in North America, or for that matter, in any of the Western world, as far as I know. Quarantine was the primary and effective tool, obviously, before the antibiotic era. It did work. We found when multi-drug resistant tuberculosis emerged in New York City in 1991, that we no longer had quarantine laws for public health. They'd all been long since superseded by civil liberties concerns. And our city health commissioner had to go to the state Supreme Court of New York to request permission to quarantine individuals who were refusing to be medicated for multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. Well, what's now happened is that as the scale of the catastrophe is unfolded in terms of Al-Qaeda, terrorism, and fearfulness in North America, and I have no idea how all this has been playing in Europe, I must say, but in North America this has obviously been an overwhelming fixation. And as it has unfolded, more and more politicians have sort of had little light bulbs go off in their heads. In many ways, they're light bulbs we would have wished had gone off decades ago, but they're going off now. They're starting to understand that health is not something that occurs within national confines, and that in terms of infectious diseases, these are international, global issues. And effective control and effective safety for the American people involves a sense of America being part of a planet rather than an isolated entity safely behind its high GNP. And that has prompted more and more people to ask the question in Washington, what are the issues most responsible for defining global health? And I'll just tell you the main message up front. I think there are 4 key gaps that are widening and that are posing a tremendous risk for exacerbating an already sorry health status of our planet. They are a widening gap in wealth distribution, a widening gap in life expectancy, a widening gap in infrastructure capacity, and a widening gap in the perception of risk and identification of what constitute the greatest risks for human beings. We're seeing all over the world a kind of a sense that the health infrastructure is falling apart, and that the sense of threat is focused on one side of the planet, on this sort of exotica, on the thrilling, on the Stephen King microbes, if you will, while the real threats may be something closer to what we've been talking about already with previous presentations. In the United States, we have seen the wealth gap widen very, very dramatically in the last 25 years. I know that America is the wealthiest country in the world, and it's tend to be viewed by outsiders in a uniform way. But I think you should realize that even in the last year, we've seen the median income of Americans decline by $1,500 a year. We've seen the numbers of people living in poverty, defined as really acute poverty for living in America, increase by nearly 1 million people just in the last 12 months. Overall, we've seen a real skewing in who has gained and who has lost wealth in America. According to our Congressional Budget Office, the average American household income over the 29 period of 1970 to 1999 increased by 10%. But the average American household income for the 1% wealthiest American households in that same time period increased by 157%. We've seen a tremendous compression of wealth, so that now a greater and greater percentage of America's wealth is actually in the hands of not 1%, not 0.1%, but 1/100%. In fact, it boils down to 13,000 families control about 3% of all the wealth of America. And the 6 wage earners, not wage earners, wealth earners alone in the United States, with Bill Gates, the Walmart family, and some other computer giants, made more money in the 1990s than the total GNPs of the 43 poorest nations in the world combined. So we're seeing a skewing domestically of wealth and internationally of wealth. What we've seen with the collapse of communism in 1991 is a tremendous realignment of wealth planet-wide. So that today, and this is from the World Bank, but it's a couple of years out of date. If it were updated, the United States percentile would now be about 25%, with the Latin American and other developing economies a little lower still. But as you can see, if you combined the United States, the EU, and Japan, you see about half the wealth concentrated in a relatively small percentage of the global population. And it's skewing very rapidly. World Bank data tells us that for 2001, if you look at GDP per capita, the United States is at the top at 35,000. The wealthiest African society, South Africa, is all the way down at 9,000. Our former nemesis, Russia, is below that at 8,000. China at 4, India at 3, and then you begin to hit the truly poor countries. If you try to look at the next stage of this, now the key point about raising the wealth gap is not to say that there's a direct correlation between wealth and health, but there is a correlation between the concentration of wealth and the resources to address problems in health. I think we've heard through every talk today a theme about, if you develop a diagnostic, who's going to pay for it? We have the needs of this huge amount of wealth on one side and the needs of another 5.5 billion people over here. But it is interesting. Now, this is a little out of date. It's from the World Health Report 1995. But you do see generally a correlation between GDP per capita and life expectancy. There's one very noteworthy exception on this list, longer lived than the USA or UK, Costa Rica. And Costa Rica is a very poor country. Not the poorest in Latin America by any means, but a poor country. It cannot possibly afford to offer advanced tertiary care to any of its population. And in fact, it's a country that's cut to the chase and said, here's what we offer you, public health. And we focus our public health efforts on under 21-year-olds. We will make sure that children have as much health as we can give them. And that seems to make, obviously, a huge difference in your ultimate life expectancy. The United States is the single biggest spender on health. If money alone dictated health, every American should live to be 90-something. We're up to 14.1% of our GDP spent on health. According to our Congressional Budget Office, the way this is going, by 2010, we'll be spending 16% of our GDP on health. And what are we getting for it? We have the lowest life expectancy of all the industrialized nations. We have the highest infant mortality of all the industrialized nations. And by any other marker you want to go through, we're way behind the EU. So clear, and way behind Japan, which only spends about 6% of its GDP on health. So money alone doesn't solve the problem. It's how you spend it, where you prioritize it, what you target. Well, one of the things that you clearly see when you start to look outside to the rest of the world and understand what are the things responsible for an increasing sense of threat or gravitas about infectious diseases is that we're seeing the most dramatic shift from rural to urban living ever in the history of our species. It is occurring at a pell-mell pace, and it's occurring in an almost absolutely chaotic fashion. This happens to be downtown Kikwit, Zaire, where the Ebola epidemic was in 1995. Kikwit, first time I went through this area back in the early 80s, Kikwit was a tiny village. And it still is, in many people's consciousness and on maps, a relatively insignificant place. But now there's 450,000 people living there in a place with no electricity, no running water, no telephone service, no industry, no major employer. Really, absolutely no reason for everybody to be there. But we're seeing all over the developing world these sort of instant conglomerations occurring without any infrastructure around them. And then as you go towards the larger cities, you see a tidal wave of humanity pouring into the periphery. But they don't pour into anything that can constitute decent housing. They pour into these slapdash shacks, into hovels. Every one of them, of course, imagines that they'll only be living here a few days, a few weeks, and then they'll make their lucky strike. They'll get that great job. This is only going to be for a short time. Until 20 years later, they're still living in this terrible hovel, if in fact they've survived. Around the world, we see more and more of cities that were hovel-driven slums turning into gigantic slums. This is Surat, India, with a population of about 800,000. This exact spot where this boy is standing is the neighborhood in which the plague epidemic of pneumonic plague erupted in 1994. And this happens to be a neighborhood where the human being to toilet ratio is 160 people per toilet facility. I don't think in a room with people with backgrounds in microbial disease, I need to weave what that means in terms of dysentery, cholera, and the like. We're seeing more and more movement into cities where people bring their rural ecology with them into these dense favelas and slums on the periphery of the cities, creating fantastic opportunities for zoonotic disease. And we're seeing tremendous overuse and misuse of water supplies. I took this picture right outside of downtown Calcutta, and it perfectly illustrates the point. You have little girls washing their hands in the same water source that a pig is urinating in, and the same water source that some other girls are washing dishes in the same water source a pig is defecating in, and way upstream in the same water source that a woman is urinating in. We're having more and more pressure on available water supplies and less sense of separation. After all these decades, so long after Jon Snow, less separation between what would be considered sewer use, what would be considered drinking water use, what would be considered agricultural use of water supplies. The pressures on the cities are tremendous, and just to give you a sense of the scale of the movement into cities, the United Nations Population Fund recently published their projections for 2015. They estimate that just looking at what are called megacities, meaning cities with 10 million or more human beings trying to all coexist. We currently have a handful of megacities. They say by 2015 we'll have 23 megacities, only 4 of which will be in developed countries. To give you an idea of the haste and speed with which these sorts of human movements and into these horrible conditions are occurring, consider Bombay. Currently has a population of 18 million, projected to, by 2015, have 26 million people. Lagos, Nigeria, will jump in this time period from 13 million to 24 million. Sao Paulo from 17 to 20 million. Karachi, Pakistan, from 11 to 19 million, and I could go on. The cities we're talking about are not places where there's finance or wherewithal or political will to create an infrastructure that can support such a massive population without being a cauldron of infectious diseases. Well, we've already had a lot of discussion about malaria, and I don't really want to repeat points previously made so eloquently by others. The one thing I would add is that the other factor that may explain not so much malaria but certainly dengue is that we're, in addition to seeing a stress on water supplies, we're seeing a lack in these cities of appropriate drainage. So that more and more frequently in urban centers we have pooled water that is serving as a fantastic site for breeding of vectors, so that we're getting more and more of a kind of urbanization of vector-borne disease. Since we've already gone through this, just say quickly, this is when we thought we could conquer malaria easily, and this was the global distribution of malaria, and this is where we are today. We've also had quite a lot of discussion about tuberculosis, and I don't want to repeat again points previously made or go through the grim numbers once again. This is a WHO slide. I think it's self-explanatory. But I do want to make a couple points about Russia, since it's been brought up a few times. I was stunned by Paul's numbers on the active case rate of tuberculosis in his area. This is Dr. Dugorova, who runs the tuberculosis control for the Buryati Republic of Russia. Most of the population of the Buryati Republic are basically Mongolians. And amongst them, the current infection rate or active case rate is 600 per 100,000, which when I spoke to her, she thought was the highest rate in the world. I now know South Africa is considerably higher. Fueling this is what's going on in all of the post-communist world in the criminal justice system right now. Before the fall of communism, criminal justice was a very straightforward thing. KGB said, you, say goodbye to your family. You're not going to ever see them again. End of story. Now they have constitutions. They have an alleged criminal justice system. There's supposed to be a body of evidence collected by a prosecution. There's supposed to be a defense attorney, and there's supposed to be judges. The problem is that there weren't a lot of lawyers. And all these countries are now, as fast as possible, training lawyers in order to have an active criminal justice system, training police in how to collect evidence and so on. But in the meantime, there's this huge backlog of people stuffed into jails who've never even been indicted in all too many cases. And you see conditions in the jails that would absolutely blow your mind. In the primary jail of Moscow, the average prisoner has 1 square meter of space. Obviously, that means you have to take turns laying down and standing up. And in the bitter cold, you cannot open windows to circulate air. So you have extraordinary potential for spread of pulmonary disease. All it takes is 1 or 2 people coughing tuberculosis in such a setting, and you soon have widespread infection. On top of it all, the criminal justice system lacks resources and, I think, a certain percentage of will to properly provide medication, so that when you talk to people who've been in the jails, they'll say, well, one day they gave me a blue pill, and the next day they gave me a red one, and then I had 3 yellow ones, and so on and so forth. So they've basically created human petri dishes for breeding multi-drug resistant strains. We actually have now determined, the Public Health Research Institute has determined that the strain responsible for our multi-drug resistant tuberculosis outbreak in New York City in 1991, the so-called W strain, originated in a jail in Siberia and found its way to the United States. Well, some of these prisoners obviously eventually have a hearing before a judge, and in all too many cases, after they've been in a jail for a year and a half and acquired tuberculosis, the judge says, I dropped the charges, go home. Then they go into their community, they are lost to follow-up. And there's really no good connection between the criminal justice treatment system and the general community health system. So now they're lost to follow-up, their treatment collapses, nobody's keeping track, and you get exposure in the community to poor individuals like this young man I met in a sanitarium in Moscow. He acquired a highly drug-resistant strain to begin with, and then he's sulfa-sensitive, rendering him basically unable to be treated with antibiotics. So they removed 1 lung, half of another, and gave him a tracheotomy through which to breathe. Right now in Russia, about 1 out of 5 TB cases are in fact surgically treated. And these are forms of treatment we've not used in North America, and I doubt here in Western Europe, in decades. Well, a lot of talk today has focused on good old HIV, and I want to walk through a few key points I think have not been raised about HIV, and I apologize any place where my slides look the same as a few of those you've already seen, such as this one. So I won't bother to detail the statistics. I do think that some numbers have not been expressed that I think are really startling. Our U.S. Census Bureau has been in the business of projecting where this epidemic was going. They've been doing it since the mid-'80s. And of all groups and individuals that have been doing forecasting, the U.S. Census Bureau's numbers have come the closest to bearing reality consistently. They forecast that by 2020, if there is no vaccine, HIV will be claiming 6,427,000 African lives a year. There are only 360 million people in sub-Saharan Africa. Killing 6.4 million annually is definitely on a scale that we can't even fathom. We can't even imagine. The Zimbabwe National AIDS Council just about 3 weeks ago adjusted their estimates of seroprevalence in Zimbabwe. They said that in 2000 the seroprevalence was 25%, but in 2002 it had hit 34% for Zimbabwe. They also estimate that a 15-year-old boy today in Zimbabwe faces 74% odds of dying of AIDS before the age of 30. And this slide you saw previously, Robin showed it to you. I want to make a different point with this slide. Much has been made about highly active antiretroviral therapy, and surely it has very much prolonged the life expectancy of people living with HIV in the wealthy world. But the really important point I see in this chart is that if you look statistically at the impact on the epidemic overall, heart is insignificant statistically. This epidemic is brand new to our species, and it is skyrocketing. It is not on a plateau anywhere. It's not on a slowdown anywhere. It hasn't encountered a population of spontaneously resistant or immune human beings. It's on its very early trajectory, a brand new epidemic. When we get down to the household level, we can already see the economic and social impact of this epidemic in very profound ways. I've spent the last 20+ years going back and forth to some of the same villages in Africa to chronicle the epidemic. And I can say pretty much everywhere I've been, the sorry story is unfolding in the same way. The difference is the pace and the severity from one place to another. When you look at the household surveys, ABT Associates of South Africa conducted a survey that was published about 4 weeks ago, showing that of all households surveyed across a wide range of South Africa, 72% of households are now headed by women, 31% of whom are HIV positive. Within 12 months, a third of all the households surveyed will lose the head of household, which means someone is going to take those children. It's unclear who. And all too many parents say that they have been forced to give up their children, to send them to secondary and tertiary relatives to raise them because of the financial strain of their disease. We've seen a tremendous shift in how this epidemic is affecting populations. It is becoming an increasingly female epidemic. UNAIDS projects that by 2010, 70% of people living with HIV disease in Africa will be female. And when you try to understand that, you can start to get at the root of why this epidemic is spreading so fast where it is spreading so rapidly, and why it's not spreading more rapidly in other areas. The first point I want to make about this, let me just go back one, is that we had some discussion about promiscuity and whether we should use that word. I don't want to go down that argument in and of itself, but I do want to make this point. AIDS is spreading the most dramatically everywhere in the world, not just in Africa, everywhere in the world. It's spreading the most dramatically, with one exception, the former Soviet Union, in countries where women have the least power to dictate the circumstances of sexual behavior. All right? This isn't about political power as in the Islamic world. This is about the power of the bed, the power of the household. And you can see very clearly that it's not about women out having many sexual partners. It's about the men out having many sexual partners. This family, for example, that I met in Tanzania, were all dying together of HIV. It came into the household because he, as is his right as a Tanzanian man, had many female partners outside the marriage, and all of them at once and constantly. And some of the household resources were spent on the many girlfriends that he kept. From one of them, he acquired HIV, passed it sexually to his wife, who gave birth to an HIV-positive child. Now they are spending all their resources. They've sold everything worth anything to speak of to pay for treatment for him, whatever they can find, however dubious its efficacy may be. By the time he dies, and I'm quite sure that by now he has passed away, the household will be bankrupt. And all finances will, whatever remains, including the land, will devolve to her in-laws, because there is no female right of inheritance. And this is true in most African societies. So the in-laws will take the home, and if they don't like her or they don't care about her, she and the baby are out on their own. Now, what skill does she have? Farming. If she doesn't have a plot of land, she can't farm. What will she do? In all too many cases, she's forced into prostitution or to find a sugar daddy, and thus perpetuating this cycle of the spread of HIV. It's cruel indeed to talk about abstinence, to talk about condoms, and to make judgmental views of how people are getting infected when you see what happens with the wives of HIV-positive men. I spent a lot of time interviewing hundreds and hundreds of women, this group in Uganda, for example, every one of whom were monogamous, were faithful to their husbands, knew their husbands were seeing many, many women outside the marriage, knew they had absolutely no right to say a word about it because their only job is to procreate, and they have no right to say anything about their husband's sexual satisfaction. And they knew full well that it was just waiting for the Russian roulette bullet. Every time they had sex with him, this might be the time he passes the virus to me. And like the woman I described previously, they were all left destitute with the death of their husbands, forced to horrible decisions about how to feed their children, what to turn to in order to stay alive. Anne Bouvet was mentioned earlier by Robin Weiss, and I think that Anne has done some of the most important and elucidative research in Africa that can help us understand what's going on. The first thing that has been noteworthy in this epidemic is that West Africa and Central Africa have had relatively stable epidemics over time. With the exception now, very worrisomely, of Nigeria, none of the West African societies have had infection rates above 5% since the 1980s. While, of course, in the East and the South, the epidemic has steadily skyrocketed. Here she's looking at women by age, time since a sexual debut. Cotonou and Yaoundé are in West Africa, Kisumu is in Kenya, and Ndola in Zambia. And you see this skyrocketing infection rate approaching 60% in Ndola 5 years out after sexual debut. This chart I find truly extraordinary, and again, it harkens back to previous discussions of rape and the sense that having sex with a virgin would take your HIV away. And what you see here is that there's not any longer a strict correlation between how many years a woman has been sexually active and her likelihood of being HIV positive. In fact, women who've had only 1 or 2 acts of sexual intercourse, and we're not even talking about women, we're talking about 15-year-old girls, are HIV positive. Couple things need to be mentioned here. One is that there is, in many parts of Africa, men have a preference for what's called dry sex, which means that the woman should not be gaining any pleasure from the act, and her vagina should be completely dry. This is considered more pleasurable for the man. It is also far more dangerous for the woman. It creates a far greater likelihood of transmission when she has no protective mucosa. In addition, this drive to have sex with virgins means that your very first sexual act involves exchange of blood because you're breaking the hymen. And so, in fact, you have an immature vagina. We're talking about extraordinary rape rates of 10-year-old girls, 11-year-old girls, and now in South Africa we have a trial involving a group that raped, I believe it was a 5-year-old girl, if I'm right. The United Nations Human Rights Commission on October 4th released a startling report noting the skyrocketing incidence of violent sex throughout southern Africa due to the belief that it will take away HIV, and that most of the targets of this have been pre-teenagers. Moving from there, you can see a very dramatic impact on life expectancy, the second big growing gap I talked about. Life expectancy has been declining in a number of parts of the world, but obviously is pushing backwards most dramatically where you have a heavy AIDS problem. The one other area that's seen a rapid reversal in life expectancy independent of HIV is the former Soviet countries, where life expectancy has been moving back the most rapidly ever seen in the industrialized world. But here we can see life expectancy now going back to World War II levels, as if 5 entire decades of development aid and investment in infrastructure and improvement in health has been erased. When I address or participate in national security discussions, very different group from what we have here in this room, the kinds of people who use acronyms to refer to nuclear missiles, I am finding that they are increasingly turning their attention to HIV and its companion tuberculosis. And the reasons they are concerned are described in the next few slides. This grandmother I met in the village of Chebe, Uganda, on Lake Victoria in the Rakai district, 83 years old. She took me on a tour of her small banana grove. And all through it there were these mounds of stones under which she had buried her husband, 10 out of 12 of her children, and 10 out of 33 of her grandchildren, every one of them a victim to AIDS. And with nothing but bananas to sell, by herself, she was raising 23 grandchildren. This is what demographers call the chimney effect, which I'll get into in a little bit. We're seeing for the first time in cultures that in many cases never even had a word in their language for orphan, for what we mean by orphan. We're now seeing an orphan crisis. Throughout slavery, colonialism, famine, civil war, the clans absorbed the orphans. The clans absorbed the crises of the individuals. And we never saw the idea that a village couldn't handle an orphan or two. The children still grew up within their clan. My grandmother was a Mackenzie. And I know that in the old days in Scotland, I didn't have to be a blood relative of another Mackenzie to knock on their door and say, I'm starving, give me food. But it was the duty of every Mackenzie to help every other Mackenzie, especially if they were Highlanders. And that really is the core basis at the village level of how society works in Africa. The clans care for one another, whether or not you're actually a direct blood relative. But what we're seeing now is the collapse of the clans. They've met their match, and the match is HIV. For the first time, we're seeing orphanages like this one I spent time in Tanzania that exclusively takes babies who've lost their parents to AIDS and are under 2 years of age. And then when they turn 2, a clan member child, girl, aged 9 or 10, is found in the same village the baby came from. And they give the babies to these little girls to raise. Most little girls are themselves AIDS orphans. And they do a pretty remarkable job of raising these kids. They feed them and they kind of take care of them like big dolls. But there are certain things they can't do. They're illiterate, so they can't teach them to read. Here goes literacy. They don't understand immunization. They don't understand why they have to slap these heavy babies on their back and walk 10 miles to a clinic. So we're seeing resurgence of measles, resurgence of other vaccine-preventable diseases. And they, of course, cannot pass on the cultural tradition because they don't know what it is. They can't identify their ancestors. So the chimney effect looks like this. And you've probably all seen these charts. Many different organizations have published them, and they've been widely circulated. This is an example put out by Family Health International. In the white, you have what would have been the distribution of the Society of Botswana in the absence of AIDS. In the red, in the presence of AIDS. And this chimney is so-called because basically in your senior citizen population is about the same size. Those who would be retired and dependent on their children. But their children are gone. The leadership of society is gone. The entire infrastructure of society and the parents, most importantly, are gone. And then you have this huge bulge of young adults and adolescents. And what do young adults and adolescents do in the absence of parental guidance and control? Well, precisely what would best transmit HIV further and further and further. This chart, and this kind of chart, more than anything else I've seen, has been persuasive to people in national security circles. They look at a chart like this and they say, what I see here is civil war. What I see here is zealous, bizarre religious fervor. What I see here is economic collapse, instability, mass famine. This is a recipe for total societal collapse. And indeed, at the local level, in some of the hardest hit parts of Africa, we already see the chimney in effect. That village in Chebe I showed you has a chimney effect. And if you want to really see what this could mean and what the future could be, go to Kansansero. Kansansero is a Lake Victoria fishing village on the border between Uganda and Tanzania. This epidemic started in Kansansero in 1971-72. They're now in their 4th generation of human devastation due to HIV. This place is like Lord of the Flies, the famous William Golding book, because it's child rule of child of child of child. Virtually everybody in the village, no matter how old they are, is an orphan due to AIDS. There's no sense of social values. It's a lawless place. Most of the boys grow up to be fishermen if they survive, and the girls grow up to be prostitutes. The little stores sell beer, tobacco, condoms, that's it. And the children are fed by random adults who put cauldrons of food in the dirt, and the children just all dive for them. Could this be Africa's future? And as we talk about the second wave, just described by the National Intelligence Council for our CIA, available for your perusal at www.cia.gov, says there are 5 nations that now constitute the second wave of HIV. These are not nations that combined have a population of 360 million. These are nations that combined constitute the majority of the planet. They are China, India, Russia, Nigeria, and Ethiopia. Let me very quickly review this, and then I can see that my time is running out. Nigeria has now topped the critical 5% point. Its national seroprevalence is now at 6%. Most troubling, in 15 to 30-year-olds living in Lagos and other major urban centers of Nigeria, it is now 15%. One of the most crucial things to think about with Nigeria, Nigeria has the largest standing army in Africa. It is the major peacekeeper and intervener for the entire West African region, and it is the world's 6th largest petroleum producer. Instability has been a hallmark of Nigeria for several decades. It's just come out of a long period of brutal military dictatorship. Sometime in April or May, they're going to hold their first legitimate elections in quite a long time. Obasanjo had been making HIV a hallmark of his administration, but as election time approaches, and it's such an unpopular subject, he's completely backed off from just talking about it. The future of Nigeria is indeed an important and frightening one, and it could reverse this whole very sort of stable sense of the epidemic that we've seen in West Africa. Ethiopia, one of the poorest countries in the entire world, per capita GDP below $200 a year. 1 physician for every 50,000 Ethiopians. Still reeling from years of brutal military rule and war with Eritrea. They already are approaching a high infection rate, and given the size of their population, could soon constitute the majority of all HIV on the African continent. They are predicted by the CIA report to, by 2010, in just 8 years, have 27% prevalence of HIV, up from today's roughly 10%. China. It's a debate who has more people, China or India, but either way, we're over 1.2 billion. China has had a long time coming to the point of willingness to have transparency about its epidemic. And it's only beginning to let the rest of the world know much of anything about its HIV problem. Clearly, China's HIV problem is much larger than its official figures would indicate. I was in a national security meeting in Washington 2 weeks ago in which Chinese representatives indicated that they don't actually even have any estimates of the sizes of their various risk group populations in order to make any sense of how this epidemic might unfold. It's currently estimated that their infection prevalence is only about 0.2% of Chinese, somewhere between 10 and 15 million people. But you know, 5% of 1.2 billion would be a heck of an epidemic, right? And the CIA report estimates that by 2010, 2% of this massive Chinese population will be HIV positive. India. India also has been slow to come to terms with their epidemic. I think it would be fair to say that they're still in a pretty serious sense of denial. While at the national level now, HIV garners some frank discussion. Health is very decentralized in India. And at the state level, there are only a couple of states that have any real HIV leadership to speak of. India currently has something around 1 to 1.4% prevalence of HIV. It has all the ripe conditions for a massive explosion. In particular, the issue I discussed with the African examples of female disenfranchisement and lack of female control of sexuality. Therefore, the CIA projects that they will have a 4% seroprevalence with about 25 million people HIV positive within 8 years. So I just want to close. Again, I don't want to repeat comments made by others today. Close by saying that in addition to the infrastructural gap issues that have been raised, there is a last crucial thing hinted at by many. That is the market failure with the pharmaceutical industry. I appreciate some suggestions that have been made about what might be done to bridge this market failure and how we might be able to induce companies to get in the game of making appropriate diagnostics for tropical settings and so on. But I think the irony is that what's going to drive it is bioterrorism. And here's why. $1.75 billion is about to be spent, is being spent as we sit here, to come up with new diagnostics, new vaccines, new treatments for bioterrorist agents. Now, what company wants to make a tularemia vaccine? Where's the marketplace for a tularemia vaccine? The likelihood that anyone would ever actually release a tularemia agent is extremely low. You know, a handful of farmers somewhere might get exposed to tularemia in a given year. This is not a market option. Already, what you hear out of our very conservative government that is highly aligned with the drug company industry, and the Republican Party has been a major recipient of pharmaceutical donations and lobbying. Already from them you hear we're probably going to have to create a national pharmaceutical production site. So because of bioterrorism, they're actually talking about the unimaginable for the highly capitalist GOP, the creation of a nationalized pharmaceutical and diagnostic production center. It will be up to all of you and to the political pressure around the world to see if it isn't possible, once that door is open, to push the next step and say, well, wait a minute, 5 anthrax envelopes, and you're ready to set up an entire infrastructure for developing vaccines for tularemia. What about HIV? What about tuberculosis? What about malaria? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laurie. I think your remarks are just an introduction to the panel discussion. And